Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin with acknowledging that we're all gathered online, but we're all on sovereign Aboriginal lands across Australia. I'm here in Meanjin on lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and my acknowledgement is not just a meaningless formality at the beginning of a meeting, but rather it's a full commitment to support you in every way possible in your struggle for land rights and self-determination. I feel incredibly privileged to be walking on your land, having the opportunity to learn from your ancient culture that, unlike many other cultures, has proven its wisdom to be at one with nature and to prioritize care for the nature in the same way as you care for family and other members of the community. Just a quick note here that letting you know that we will be recording the session today and we'll be making it available online, as we have had many requests from people who couldn't attend today. My name is CEMH. I'm the Director of Youth Affairs Network of Queensland, also known as YANQ, which is the peak body for the youth sector in Queensland. I'm a Persian speaking, originally from Iran. Had to leave Iran in 1985 when I was 17. I became a refugee and spent a couple of years in Pakistan and India before having the really good fortune of being able to migrate to Australia under humanitarian grounds. I've been working in various youth sector roles for the past 36 years or so. As some of you know, YANQ's entire operational funding was cut by state government 12 years ago. So we've been operating without core funding for 12 years. During these challenging times, we've downsized our operations significantly and currently just run mainly on volunteer basis. However, we have more than doubled our membership during this time to over 750, which indicates a strong support for us from the sector still. One of the initiatives that we have been running for the past few years is called the Youth Work Community of Practice. And this has been mainly an online strategy. And it basically brings the sector together to learn from one another, to support one another, and to improve our youth work practice. Back in 2020, YANQ hosted an online forum focused on the role of youth workers in supporting young people with mental health issues. And one of the things that was raised in this forum, was that the youth workers felt, they expressed that they felt ill-equipped to assess mental health issues of young people. And as a result, they told us that there was a large number of young people who were being referred to clinical mental health services. This was really concerning for us, and we wanted to do something about this. Because it has various implications. One is that young people not having the opportunity to, build meaningful relationships with youth workers and being able to talk through the issues that they might have at a youth service level, and also putting unnecessary strain on the clinical mental health services, which then the young people that do need those services not being able to access them. It took us a few years, but last year, finally, we secured the necessary funding thanks to the Queensland Gaming Community Benefit Fund that allowed us to proceed with developing the resources that hopefully can assist youth workers when working with young people in distress, and also include some tips for youth workers to feel more comfortable about knowing at what stage and how to refer young people to clinical mental health services. To develop these resources, YANQ partnered with Adelaide University's Critical and Ethical Mental Health Unit, Research Unit group, which promotes safer, more effective, and more ethical research and practice in mental health. During the first stage of the project last year, we administered a wide sector survey, holding focus groups and conducting interviews with youth workers in order to find key issues about working with young people in distress, including drivers that instigate clinical referrals. During that stage, YANQ also conducted interviews with Headspace and hospitals, other clinical services, to attain patterns of referral by youth workers. This information was then analyzed by Ethical Mental Health Research Group, headed by Professor John Giardini. The information was then used to develop training resources that we'll be launching today. We are very privileged to have John with us today. He will give us an overview of the training packages and how to use them. There will be a Q&A session at the end of John's presentation. So please jot down any questions that you may have during the presentation and share it with us during the Q&A. Before I hand over to John, I want you all to please write your full name in the comment box so we can know that you have participated in the forum, and we can post you a free copy of the book Language Matters, which accompanies this training package. Also, please, if you could mute your microphones during the presentation, I will greatly appreciate that. So without further ado, I'll pass on to John.
Thank you, CEMH. Begin by endorsing CEMH's sincere appreciation of everything we have being, to a certain extent, to the expense of the damage we've done to the first inhabitants of the country that we live in. The work that we do is all about relationships, relationships with kids in particular, young people. I'll use those kinds of terms interchangeably if you'll indulge me, but also with the team that you work with and the people that you work for. So this training package, while it's primarily directed towards youth workers, and the whole purpose of the consultation that CEMH has talked about was to try as much as possible to make it suitable, make the way in which the information is presented and the focus of the information most suitable for youth workers. It's also directed at people who manage and hopefully strongly support what youth workers do. And also it's hopefully useful to the people who get referrals or collaborate with, more positively collaborate with youth workers in working with young people. So I'll just screen share for a while to give you an idea of how the course is set up. Just let me get on to the right. Sorry. You're seeing the screen at the moment? Because I'm not.
Seeing your screen, but it's not the presentation, the actual training packages. It's
Okay.
data set.
All right.
For new people who've joined in, if you could please write your full name in the comment box so we can know that you've participated and you'll receive the book that accompanies this training package called Language Matters.
People will need to provide their mailing addresses as well, won't they, CEMH?
I have already, when they registered, they've given us the
okay.
mailing addresses. So this is just to confirm they participated in this session. So that's we can see the right screen now, John. Thank you.
Okay. So just to say a little bit about the Pediatric Mental Health Training Unit, which is what's the group that have been responsible for producing the training package. We're funded to provide training to medical students, teaching to medical students at Adelaide University, but we have a broader remit and ambition to provide education in non-medicalised approaches to distress more broadly than that, and therefore incredibly grateful for the opportunity that CEMH gave us to make some of our ideas open to youth workers in Queensland and elsewhere. So you'll see The course is it consists of a number of modules, and you could rush through it in a couple of hours probably, but what we'd prefer you to do is to take your time over it and do a module at a time over several weeks, and talk with other team members or collaborators about what your reactions are to what we've told you, because there's the information and experience that we can pass on to you. But what we also aim to provide is a stimulus for you to tap into your own expertise and to share that expertise amongst yourselves to enhance the work that you do. So you can see there's this series of 6 modules, and it starts with an introduction, instructions about how to make use of it, what the learning outcomes are relevant to this particular module. And it actually starts off with a message to managers, because we don't think that it's possible for youth workers to do their jobs properly and make a difference in young people's lives if their managers can't provide them with a safe and reflective working environment where we can all learn from our experience and enhance the work that we do. So right at the beginning, we start off with activities that relate to reflective practice and encourage you and particularly your managers, and hopefully I'm speaking to several managers here today about the importance of establishing a reflective environment. Because one of the messages that we're going to give today is that we've got to live with uncertainty, and we've got to live with less than complete understanding of what's going on for the young people that we work with. And in order to work well and not in a totally risk-averse way, which, as I'll talk more about today, is not going to be in our young people's best interests. If we're not going to be risk-averse, we have to feel well supported in our working environment. The other thing we need to do you need to do as youth workers, is have a really good and healthy respect for what youth workers do and the difference that youth workers can make. And youth workers aren't a lesser version of differently trained health workers and mental health workers. You have your own niche and your own skills, and most importantly, the quality and depth of relationship that you can develop with young people, which is different from what other workers can do. And so that's module 1. The second module focuses on social needs and the social determinants of health. And like all of the modules, there's a mixture of video materials. We've tried to keep the videos relatively short so that they're engaging. A lot of it is experts talking to you about what they think you should do. So we invite you to challenge that and incorporate the things that you find helpful, challenge and discuss with your colleagues where you think we might have missed the point. And there are activities that can be done individually, but hopefully are a stimulus to further discussion amongst yourselves, and a range of extra reading for people who, particularly in the area of social determinants, get captured by the importance of attending to social needs, which is something that we do have to press home to a lot of our colleagues working in the mental health system. I'm sure that youth workers are much more tuned into the social needs of young people. And then some ideas about working with young people, what happens when you get stuck in your work, some hints about some techniques that we find useful. Just one point in terms of navigating your way through the system. When you come to the videos, they'll often start off at quite low resolution. So if you click on this settings button and go to the highest available quality, if you've got a reasonable um, uh, broadband link to the video, you'll find that the quality of image improves significantly, and more importantly, the sound is better. So it's worth doing that with most of the videos. Again, activities. And from Module 3, we introduce fragments of a clinical interview between a worker and a patient, or a young person presenting to a youth work setting. Sorry, I'll slip back into talking about patients because that's what I've been doing for 40 years. Apologies if that's not the language that people like to use, because we do think that language is really important. So you'll meet Jade and get to know her through the course of subsequent modules. And this is not meant to present a perfect assessment process. So there's plenty of room for you to be critical and to build on what you see Callum doing in his interview with Jade. As I'll talk more about when I've finished this run through, we really value very highly the task of making meaning of a young person's difficulties rather than categorizing their difficulties. And so there's quite a bit about how we go about doing that. I'll cover some of this as we talk more today. So here we're looking at kinship maps and eco maps. Some of you may already be familiar with those tools. Then we move on to a particular approach to finding out about what might be happening in a young person's life, making a sequence, which is the idea that you learn much more from finding out in a great deal of detail about one important thing that's happened in a young person's life than you'll learn by asking them all kinds of questions about what they think or what other people think is wrong with them. And an example of Callum engaging in eliciting a sequence from a young person. We'll say some more about the book that you're going to get a copy of that Anthony, who I think is online today, and Melissa have written. And then what do you do with all of that? The whole impetus to developing this training was about making good referrals and what to do when there are red flags. We make no apology for the fact that that's only one module as part of this program, because we feel that all this other stuff about making meaning of a young person's presentation is all stuff that you need to get under your belt before you begin to think about making referrals. And hopefully at the end of doing this training and all of the reflections and interaction that goes with it, you'll be in a better position to make good referrals, and also you will feel less need to refer on. You'll feel more confident to sit with risk and uncertainty. We think the way in which the module's been put together is engaging, and I can say that without being boastful because our colleague Natalie Abustate did all of this, and I think she's done a great job of converting some materials into something that is a really useful learning package. Hopefully that's enough of a run over. What I'm going to say today is, what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about today is mainly the concepts that underlie the training package. So I'm not going to try and reproduce what we've put into the training, but hopefully after today, what I say will enrich your experience of making use of the training that's going to be available to you. So the first really strong message that we want to get across is that distress, and even very serious distress, is not necessarily or even most often a manifestation of illness or psychiatric or mental health disorder. At an individual level, it's best to think of whatever a young person brings to you as manifesting their best attempt to cope with the circumstances that they find themselves in. So if they were coping well with their circumstances, they probably wouldn't be coming to your attention. So even though the behaviours that they present with might appear to be really bad choices, that it might seem to you and to other people that there are much better ways of dealing with their distress, you can take as a beginning assumption that this is the best job they can do with the circumstances that they find themselves in. One of the ways in which young people often present, and which young people often cross the threshold so that it appears that somebody needs to give attention to their distress, is by self-harming. And it's common in my work for people who are caring for young people, whether it's parents or others, to go from sort of 5 out of 10 worried about a young person to 9 out of 10 worried about them when they find out that they're engaging in self-harm. Now, here I'm not talking about mutilating, self-mutilation, or the kind of cutting that needs emergency medical attention. I'm talking about the much more common situation in which people burn or cut themselves in a way that might require first aid, but is self-limiting and self-healing. And we should always think of that as a coping mechanism. We should think that this young person is telling us and telling the world that things aren't right with them and that this is the best way they've got of managing their distress. And actually, as a coping mechanism, it's much less dangerous than a lot of other coping mechanisms that we see young people engage in. Reckless use of alcohol and other drugs, reckless promiscuity, aggressive behaviour. All of these are coping mechanisms that people are resorting to. What our task is when we encounter these coping mechanisms is to try to make meaning of that coping mechanism. I hear a lot of talk about emotional dysregulation. And so another way in which people present to us is, or we become aware of their distress, is that somebody says that they're dysregulated. And that, I guess that's good shorthand to say that the capacity to make sense of and manage the emotional experience that the person's having has exceeded their capacity. I think when we're talking about regulation, we need to be a little bit more subtle than just to say this person is dysregulated. It's possible to make a distinction between somebody who's unregulated and somebody who's dysregulated. So I think about people being unregulated when they just don't have the maturity, they don't have the skills and the capacity, they haven't internalized all of the things that we need to be able to manage ourselves in the environment that we're placed in. So we see this just for ordinary kids in school. If you look at children in a class and you compare the 25% who are oldest with the 25% who are youngest, then the youngest children are roughly 1.5 to 2 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and treated with stimulants than the oldest members of the class. And so that's just a manifestation of the fact that they come into that classroom environment less mature than their peers. And so they're not really dysregulated, they just are not yet equipped to be able to cope with the demands of the classroom. Another child in a setting who's not managing, whose problems might be attributed to attention deficit, might in fact have their attention being dysregulated by other things that are going um, that are preventing them from exercising their capacity to regulate themselves. So, for example, if they come to school hungry, then they're not going to be able to manage themselves and the demands of the school environment in the same way that if they're well fed. And that's why giving kids breakfast, particularly in deprived areas, can make a difference to educational outcomes in schools. And the third form of regulation that people need to think about is this behaviour actually regulating? It might appear to be dysregulated. Somebody who comes into an environment, whether it's school or a residential care facility or some other environment that makes demands on their ability to manage themselves and their emotions, is if that young person is preoccupied by their fear that their father's going to come home and kill their mother, then running around and playing the fool and appearing to be really distracted might place them into a much better regulated state of mind than if they sat still and tried to pay attention to what was happening. Because if they do that, then they're going to be flooded by memories and fears associated with their bad experience or the bad experience that they're expecting. So what that makes really important is that we don't think when a child presents with what we regard as maladaptive behaviour, that the task is to stop, to punish or to not reward that bad behaviour and to replace it with some kind of better behaviour. First of all, we need to make meaning of it. And one way of making meaning of it is, does this behaviour represent the fact that this person is not yet mature enough to deal with the circumstances in which they're placed? Is there something happening that is distracting or preventing the young person from managing circumstances that they would otherwise be able to manage? Or is the child so overwhelmed by adversity or the memory of adversity that this is their best effort to keep themselves regulated in this, what for them is a hostile environment? So your residential care unit might be a really safe, comfortable place with caring people, but you can't assume that that's what the experience of the young person is having in that environment because of all of the stuff that they bring in with them. So another corollary of that is that we need to be really conscious of reminding ourselves that what's important is not what's wrong with this person, whether they fit diagnostic criteria for depression or ADHD or PTSD. It's what's happened to them. What's their story? And so when you look at the Language Matters book, you'll see that a lot of it is about finding alternative language that isn't pathologizing. So if we talk about a depressive disorder, we're locating the problem in the child. We're even inviting to think about there might be something wrong with this person's brain, that they've got a broken brain. If instead we were to talk about a depressive reaction, then that begs the question, what's it a reaction to? And so that invites us to think about what might have happened to this young person. So that quite subtle shift in language between depressive disorder and depressive reaction, or attention deficit disorder and attention deficit reaction, is actually energizing and respectful of agency and respectful of the experience that people have had. And you'll see throughout Anthony and Melissa's book that there are a lot of other useful ways in which we can modify the way in which we use language. there are two words that are used, and they're both good words and descriptive words that have their place. The first is trauma. Now, it's more productive to think of an explanation from a young person's maladaptive behaviour as being the result of trauma than to think that they've got a broken brain. But there is a danger that we objectify, we make it into a thing. This person has trauma, as though and then it just becomes like another, this person has depression. And it also, I think, when we start to talk about every adverse experience that we have as a trauma, it really devalues what happens when somebody's been raped or been through some really dramatically damaging experience. So I'd encourage you to try to use words like trauma carefully and not to use it as too much of a shorthand to replace an attempt to understand what's happening for a young person. The other thing is people talking about being triggered. That just because a situation is uncomfortable for you and reminds you of some adverse experience, I think that is very different from somebody who, has had some very violent assault on them and is experiencing quite dislocating and incapacitating responses to some environmental reminder of those circumstances. So again, I think triggered is a word that can be devalued if it's used too widely. Those of you who are interested in that idea might look up what happened to Peter Laylaw, a cricket commentator who made some quite benign supportive comment about Palestinians and was sacked from his radio station because his voice was thought to be triggering for people listening to him talk on the radio. I'm still thinking at the individual level, and I apologise a bit for spending so much time on the individual level when the message we're trying to get across is about relationships and social circumstances. But there are a couple more things I want to say about as we consider the young person at an individual level. The first of them is about respecting distress and not having an immediate need, the first response not being, I need to make this person feel better. Strong, uncomfortable feelings of anger, sadness, fear, shame are healthy. They're not comfortable and they can become unhealthy. But our first assumption shouldn't be that because a person is very distressed, there's something wrong with them and we need to make them feel better. Because feeling better might actually be closer to feeling numb. And when we use medication to make people feel better, what we are doing to a large extent is numbing them, and we're robbing them of the richness of their experience. Now, in certain circumstances, that might be necessary or desirable, but we really need to be honest about what we're doing. So when we give somebody antidepressants, we're not transforming them from a depressed person to an undepressed person. What we're doing is dampening down the worst of the feelings that are making it impossible for them or really difficult for them to function. And that is less often a good decision than people think. And certainly the vast majority of people who are prescribed antidepressants, there are better ways of dealing with their distress than using medication. So I like to think that you see those air conditioning advertisements, 22 degrees all year round. That makes me a bit unhappy because I don't want to be 22 degrees all year round. I want to experience a variety of emotional temperatures. I'm happiest when it's 22 degrees, but I think my life would be diminished if I was 22 degrees all of the time. And then the last thing I want to say at an individual level is that even a quite major breakdown in a young person's functioning may not be, in the long term, an overall adverse experience for them. A lot of the young people that we encounter, and here I'm not talking so much about people who've had a terrible life and have been, haven't learnt the basic, haven't been supported, haven't been regulated by others in order to be able to regulate their own functioning. I'm talking more about young people who seem to have been going along reasonably well and who've had not terrible childhood experiences, haven't had too many adverse childhood experiences. And in adolescence or early adulthood, they have some kind of what we might describe as a breakdown. They become desperately depressed or very anxious, or maybe even have some symptoms that people think of as psychosis. And sometimes that's because the apparent adaptation that they've shown during their early years has come at a cost to them. So maybe they've grown up in a family where on the surface things are okay, but mum and dad hate each other, and they try and cover it up, but the kids have been sensitive to it, and they've adopted a role of wanting to please the parents and keep the peace in the family. And they've done a more or less reasonable job of that. And that spills over into school, where they're seen as being cooperative and pleasant in the classroom. And then as they get to adolescence and they begin to have a richer view of the way the world is, that's not okay anymore. And they begin to, in a clumsy or awkward way, try out different ways of behaving. And from the outside superficial point of view, they've gone from a good kid to a bad kid, or a healthy kid to an unhealthy kid. But actually, their functioning is much more healthy than it was before. And if they can be supported and scaffolded as they experiment with and make mistakes with trying out new ways of dealing and letting themselves experience emotions that they've suppressed during the years, then actually they can come out of that experience much better equipped for adulthood than if they continue to use those what appeared to be adaptive ways of coping that they'd used through their earlier years. So, and it can be really difficult and stressful to take that approach to somebody who's breaking down in front of you and who the default position is to think, well, this should be dealt with in the mental health services and this is out of my league. It may not be. It may be that your continued support and understanding and validation of that young person's experience is mostly what they need through that experience of developmental breakdown. So I want to say a bit less about what's happening at the level of relationships and at the level of broader society. There's quite a bit about this in the modules. But at the level of relationships, we think it's really important to have a good understanding of a young person's family circumstances. And we think that applies just as much to people who are dislocated from their families as it does for people who are still very much immersed in family life. We really need to know about quite a bit of detail about the 8 or 10 closest family members. And that may be conventional family members, or it may be people who stand instead of genetic family members. So what we're trying to develop is a kind of kinship map of who's who in the young person's life. Because when I go on to hear the young person's story about what's happened in their life, I'm much better equipped to make sense of that if I know who's who. And it's not just the people who are here now. Sometimes the people who aren't here are just as important as the people who are. And they have a really big, strong presence in the young person's life and in our understanding of what they're going through. So I find that if I go through that process very early in the course of meeting a young person, by the time I've done a kinship map or a genogram or a family tree, depending on how you want to refer to it, by the time I've done that, I've quite often got some quite good ideas about what I think is the um, is the big thing in the young person's life. You know, I'm much more able to help a young person when I have that, "Oh, I get it" experience, when I can kind of see why it is that they're overwhelmed and what it is that's exceeded their capacity to deal with productive and adaptive coping mechanisms with the adversity that they're experiencing. That I get it experience, then a lot of what I do then is just common sense, validating their experience, helping them to change the things that can be changed, accept the things that can't be changed. It's not highly technical stuff often. So, and the genogram for me, or the kinship map, is the tool, the 10 minutes that is most likely to get me started on that process of the I get it now experience that's so important. The other thing that really helps me with that is the sequence, and it's not just a sequence of what the kid did and when they did it. What did other people do? Where did it happen? What were the circumstances that led up to it? What happened afterwards? Was the young person dealt with kindly or cruelly, or somewhere in between?
That's
So,
great.
um, so I think there's some people who aren't muted. Would you make sure that your microphones are muted?
Yes.
So that idea of mapping a person's relationships, and there's also, when you start to look at broader social relationships outside the family, or family substitute or alternative family, um, looking at the ecosystem in which the young person lives. And as a youth worker, you might be inclined to think that you have a very minor and even trivial role in a young person's life. But when you map it out, don't underestimate how important a role you might have. Sadly, some of the young people we work with have such impoverished relationships that that just having an adult who is attentive, compassionate, validating, empathic, um, even just for minutes, is a potentially contributing to a healing and developmentally enhancing experience for that young person. And then at the social level, the reason why the young people we see in difficulty are in difficulty is almost always a product of the social circumstances in which they've grown up, and these are things that um, that society needs to address: poverty and inequality, insecurity of accommodation and food, and um, living in environments where violence is part of day-to-day life, inadequate schooling, being deprived of the protective effects of a good school experience, which can make up for so much that's missing in young people's lives. All of those are things that you can't do very much about on a day-to-day basis. That there do need to be organisations like YANQ in place, so that when you're frustrated by the difficulties of working on a day-to-day basis at an individual level with what are systemic problems, then that can be fed into a peak organisation like YANQ, and YANQ can go to politicians and other people with money and power and represent the kids that you see, that there's a limit to what you can do on an individual basis to push their point of view. I mean, you can go to your members of parliament, and I'd encourage you to do things like that, both individually and through your organisations. But it's terrible that organisations like YANQ are running on a voluntary basis. And if any of the organisations that you work for can do anything to change that, then I think that's a really core part. It's not just something you do on the side. It's something that is actually going to have a beneficial effect on the young people that you're working with. So I won't talk for too much longer, but I just want to say something about the tools that you have as youth workers to make a difference to the young people. And the biggest tool is you yourself. We know that in clinical settings, whether it's somebody running a surgical clinic, or somebody working in a psychiatry clinic, or somebody working in a youth work setting, over half of the difference we make is due to the relationship we have with people. So don't worry so much about what you can't do, the skills that you don't have, the resources that aren't available to you. What you have is what we all have, what we all share, is the capacity to enter into relationship with the young person that you're working with. And that's not necessarily easy. It's not just a matter of being nice or caring. And there's an acronym that I find really useful to help me to get into relationship with young people, with anybody. It's PACE, and it's something developed by Dan Hughes for use with mothers, with young mothers with babies. But I think it's just as applicable to any potentially therapeutic relationship. You always need to remain playful, to have a lightness of touch in our interactions, not to be weighed down even by terrible circumstances, to be able to, there are situations in which lightness of touch disappears because things are so dreadful, but not as often as you might think. We need to be accepting, not judgmental. We need to be curious. That's probably for me the most important part, to maintain curiosity and interest about what it is that's led the person to be who they are and where they are now, and to be empathic. And empathy is something that I think it's more important to show than to tell. More often it's a facial expression, or, oh my God, or that's terrible, than saying something like, I can really understand how difficult this might be for you to go through the things that you're going through, which can sound condescending or like it's sort of rote. And I think what we're looking for is compassion, to demonstrate compassion to a young person, and to validate their experience. So in medicine, we talk about watchful waiting, which is very different from doing nothing. It's trying our best to reach the best level of understanding that we can of a young person's circumstances, to do any non-specific things that we might be able to do to enhance their well-being, but not to be worried if there's nothing direct that we can do to intervene with the primary problem that they bring along. Obviously, if there's something there that needs to be done, if we need to get somebody out of a situation in where they're subject to violence, or we need to make sure they've got a roof over their head, or we need to make sure they've got access to education, of course, do those things. But where we don't have those interventions, or where that's not enough, then just being there, and I shouldn't put just in front of that, being there is vital. And okay, that's all I can offer you for today. But I'd like to see you again next week, and I'll be in touch before then. And if things worry you before then, here's a number you can ring for me. I'm only available at these times, but if I'm not available, somebody else is. If they're not available, here's the number for Lifeline or whatever. So that you're thinking through all of the things that might might challenge the young person and trying to scaffold their experience. But talking about coping, not safety, talking about what they can do and what other people can do to enhance their well-being. I meet lots of young people who say, "Yeah, I spoke to that person, and he really didn't want me to kill myself, but actually that wasn't because he cared about me. That was just because he didn't want to end up in front of the coroner." So we've got to. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but the coroner's always on our shoulder, and we need to have strategies to maybe move the coroner a little bit more into the background. One of the things that I really want to try and resist is to get into behaviour management. This applies more to those of you who are working in residential care environments, where there might be a lot of emphasis on behavioural modification techniques, rewards and punishments. Just as a bit of a digression, you have to talk about punishments if you talk about rewards. It's no good talking about rewards and consequences, or just talking about the fact that we're only going to reward good behaviour, we're not going to punish bad behaviour. The absence of a reward is a punishment. The absence of a punishment is a reward. And so if you're in the business of behaviour modification, you're in the business of punishment. You might not like that, but that's an absolute corollary of behaviour management of that kind. So if people are, I don't want to go into more detail about that. And in fact, the modules don't go into much detail about behaviour management. If that's something that any individuals or organisations would like to explore our ideas more about that, about the primacy of recognising what young people are avoiding and how they're managing their world by their behaviour, and that they're not going to be much shifted by what to them might seem trivial rewards and punishments, then we could talk to you about providing some training in that area. The next thing I want to talk about is taking good risks. Coming back to the coroner, if you're primarily motivated by avoiding going to the coroner's court, then you refer everything on and you define everything as somebody else's problem. And with a bit of luck, that approach will keep you out of the coroner's court, because there will always be somebody with a more apparent expertise or more recent contact with the young person who'll be the person hauled over the coals. Now, I don't want to trivialise the appropriate fear associated with going into a coroner's court, because on the whole, sometimes people are kind and compassionate when you appear in court, but often they're not. So it is something to be feared, but it needs to be taken into account along with a lot of other things, not just be the primary motivation for how you make decisions. So one of the competing interests is what can I do to increase this young person's agency? And so taking a risk-averse approach will almost inevitably rob the young person of agency. It also robs you of agency, and it underestimates the importance of your relationship with the young person. I'd much prefer to see a young person being supported and helped by somebody with less skills and training, but a better relationship, than somebody with greater skills and training, but a lesser relationship with the young person. So now doing that, taking the good risk of saying, I recognise that there's some possibility that this person is going to make bad choices that could be dangerous for them. I'm prepared to take that risk. That's not something you should do on your own. That's something that needs to be done in the context of working in a safe organisation where you can trust your managers, where your managers are making available space for reflection, are making appropriate distinction between line management, which is making sure that you're fulfilling all the KPIs for your job, and reflective supervision, which means that you've got an opportunity to think about your work, to talk about mistakes that you've made in a safe environment, to learn from others, to have people engage in helpful criticism of what you do, and also, just as importantly or more importantly, to help you to recognize and validate the good things that you're doing. When you're operating in that kind of an environment, you can begin to take good risks. You will flourish in your therapeutic skills and your counselling skills. You'll get much more job satisfaction, and much more importantly, the young people that you work with will benefit from that much more than they would from what you might regard as more sophisticated therapeutic intervention in other settings, because the two things to keep in mind: only about 50% of young people who are referred on to some other expert resource actually get there. So there's only a 50-50 chance that they're going to get the training, the attention that you think they need. And secondly, there's there's a reasonable chance that they won't get good care in that organisation. Even the best of organisations will fail to connect with the proportion of young people, just as you'll fail to connect with the proportion of young people. So if you've already made a good connection with somebody, then make use of that. Be prepared to acknowledge how important that is in terms of what's going to be the outcome for the young person. So don't take risks that you're uncomfortable with if you don't feel supported. But do work towards, and if you're not feeling supported to take risks, then probably you need to have a good think about whether the organisation is one that you feel safe to continue working in, and can you elicit change in the organisation, or do you need to think about alternative approaches to your career? And I know that's easy for me to say as somebody who's at the end of their career. You need money and you need to look after yourselves. The referral process, there's quite a bit in the last module about what we think are good ways to make a referral. But as somebody who's on the receiving end of referrals from people like you, it really makes a difference if the person referring demonstrates that they've got an investment in the young person and they care about what the outcome is going to be, and better still, that they're going to stay involved in the young person's care and would appreciate whatever advice or support I might have to offer in that process. Try not to make your referral a kind of hospital pass where this is too difficult for me. I'll make it somebody else's problem. I just need to move the person on. If you're fearful, there can be a tendency to think, well, I should be, perhaps people think I should be able to manage this. And if I spell out in my referral the reasons why I couldn't manage it, then I'm going to look stupid. Actually, it's incredibly helpful to have from the person who's making the referral. Like the challenges I faced in working with this young person were, that I couldn't manage the level of their anger. I'm hoping that you've got additional resources that will make that possible. That might be a really good referral, and in the end reflects really well on you as a referrer, doesn't show you in a poor light. Okay, so I hope I haven't overwhelmed you by talking at you for an hour. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about is elaborated on in the modules, and in a way that enables you to take your time over considering what you like and what you don't like. We're here for discussion. If it's just a small point that you wanted to raise an issue about, I'm happy to respond to emails. If this elicits thoughts about some kind of training need in your organisation, we'd be happy to negotiate about a bespoke training activity for you. And if there's any other way that you think we might be helpful, we'd be happy to hear about it. And now I'd be happy to take questions or comments or criticisms.
Thanks, John. Just before we go there, we're still getting some sound background. If you're not talking, could you please mute yourself? And please use the raise hand emoji if you have a question, comment, criticism of John, myself, anyone, and we'll try to respond.
I'd just like to make a comment before the questions all start flooding in too. Just to John, what you said made so much sense. I've just retired after 30 years. To people on here who don't know me, and after 30 years as a youth worker, I will tell everyone the most important thing is the relationship you build with young people. Build that trust, and you can make a difference in their lives, and they can possibly go on and lead a good life. But it's all about relationships. So, God, where were you 30 years ago, John? Where could have learned 30 years ago? Took me a long time to get it, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you for such a good presentation.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
Jasmine?
Hi, John. Thanks so much for such a great presentation. Oh, my video's off. Oh, sorry, my camera's just stopped working. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. There was so much, so many valuable insights. And I'm sure once we go through the modules online, it'll become more clear. But I really like the kinship maps and what you said about that. And the program that I work for is a peer-to-peer support program that we go into schools and do peer-to-peer support training skills with about 10 kids. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on if you think that would be an appropriate activity for young people to do together and share their kinship maps as a way of building stronger connections.
Yeah, I think it would be better if there was somebody like you there as well at the same time while they're doing
Yeah.
it, because sometimes there's a sort of sudden realization of something or become distressing for the person. But I think, if you just sit down and do your own kinship map, I'd encourage, if you're thinking about, you haven't used them before and you're thinking about trying them, I'd strongly encourage you, before you try them with somebody you're working with, to first do your own.
Yeah.
And then practice doing one with a colleague before you go in and do it with a young person. And when you do your own, there's often oh yeah, I get that now experience associated with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thanks. That's a good idea. I think I really liked what you said as well about the people that aren't there anymore. I found that really valuable. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, when I'm hearing a story, about, say, a young person who's attempted suicide, and you're hearing about you're getting involved, and your mum did this, and my brother did that, and I went to hospital. And if I haven't done the kinship map, I might not think to ask, well, where was Dad, and what would have been different if he'd been there?
Yeah, so true. Yeah, that'll be really handy. Thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to doing the training.
A few people have been asking, how do we access the training resources? So the training resources are all on Adelaide University's website, and I will be sending everyone a link after this meeting. I will email you with a link to that one. Now we've got a couple of hands up. First one, Dean, please go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, so basically, like my last job when I was in Northern Ireland, we did a lot of emotional resilience work, a lot of like mental health type projects. And we had our own sort of model for mental health, which was called Life Maps, which was this like positive psychology model. But one of the things that was sort of drilled into us was that there was two ways of approaching like mental health work with young people. One was quite a medicalized way, and one was like a social intervention. And we were more the social intervention, the emotional support, that sort of guidance type role. But we always sort of maintain those boundaries between actually this is where the medical professionals come in, this is where they're needed, and that's their role, and this is our role. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit about that boundary and how you sort of maintain it, whereby you don't end up sort of becoming involved in a situation where you're acting further than you maybe should be, and with a young person where you're not maintaining that boundary as a worker, where you slip and you start to speak out of your own professional capacity. Is there a way that you would sort of manage that, or would you say that that risk, and you were talking about taking risk, that risk is something that you should avoid?
No, I think that's where the reflective practice comes in, that each time you consider referring somebody on, like there's no, unfortunately, or the reality is that there's no, I mean, there are extreme criteria. If somebody's self-mutilating, or if they're frankly psychotic, or they're imminently about to, they've got a gun at home and they're about to go home and shoot themselves. Now, there are some situations in which it's very obvious that you need to get somebody into the mental health system. But otherwise, I think it's a, you can go right up to the edge of those kinds of things without sending people into the mental health system if you have developed the competence over the years to work with such young people, if you're adequately supported in the team that you're working with, if you've got people to reflect with, and if you've got a suitably positive working relationship with that young person. So I really don't hold with the view that there's one set of actions or skills or interventions that are used in the youth work system, and there's another set of actions that are used in the mental health system. The relationship is key in both places, and there isn't anything that I do, well, there's very little that I do that wouldn't be open to a youth worker to do, and vice versa. But we obviously specialise in different ways in different settings.
So maybe it's worthwhile to give a bit more context. So I had a young person who we were mentoring, and they had suicidal ideation, self-harm, drug abuse problems, but they had had a bad experience of the mental health professionals. So they were very, very reluctant to seek that type of support. And then I kind of felt that they were relying on me for that type of support. Whereas then I was in this situation, which is what sort of support do I give? Do you know what I mean? So that's in terms of professional boundaries, that's what I'm sort of thinking is like, where have I stepped over the line into terms of getting myself into a situation where it's more difficult to manage and that I'm not equipped for?
So there the discussion is between optimal management, which would have been to refer into mental health services in your judgment, which I respect, and harm minimisation. And so the harm minimisation strategy is for you to continue to work with the young person in order to provide whatever support you can, and to clearly document why you're doing that and what you would have preferred to have been the management plan, but the young person's not buying into that. You continue to offer what you think is optimal care. And again, you've got to be supported by your team to do that and to acknowledge that. And if that's not judged by you and your team to be something that's safe, and by safe, I'm not there talking about is there risk involved? Of course there's risk involved, but is there an unacceptable level of risk involved? Then in that case, it needs to be escalated in some way.
Thank you.
Casey, you had a question, comment?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Cool. I might just give a quick background because it'll make a little bit more sense. So I currently am a social inclusion coordinator at Headspace Townsville. I've just finished my honours for my social work degree, and it was actually on the lived experiences of youth workers. So what I did is the name of the research is the lived experience of youth workers understanding service delivery practices within Queensland non-government residential youth care organisations. So I had a focus group. I did it in person. I had about 5 youth workers attend who are no longer in the field anymore. They're actually in various other positions higher up now. Anyway, they spoke a lot, I guess, about what your program has. So a lot about the modules. One in particular that I noticed, and I noticed a lot of other people kind of coming up saying, with the boundaries and things like that, was a youth worker needs the ability to essentially implement consistent boundaries. I guess what Dean was saying too it is a bit hard because when they rely on you for, I guess, guiding them into these services, you don't want to overstep your, like, when am I helping and when am I hindering? I guess is the question. There were a few other things that were raised as well, and I noticed that it wasn't. I obviously haven't done your modules yet, but I noticed that it wasn't, I guess, an area of focus was a youth worker's safety. And I know that comes both personally and their skill set, but also from a managerial position as well. So there was a lot of concern raised and even stories raised about, I guess, youth workers being left on shift and not being allowed to access medical support, which then begged the question to me about their rights on shift because, everybody has a right to safety. And if they've been, one of their situations was, as many youth workers probably, I was a youth worker for 8 years myself, you don't always get all the information when you get a young person arrive on your doorstep. The information didn't match the young person. As a consequence of that, the young person ended up hitting this youth worker in the head with a big metal pole. She was then told that nobody could replace her on shift, so she has to stay on shift. And there was a lot of those and more, it's not published yet. It is going to be published, so I can definitely reach out, and I would like to maybe even speak offline with you if that's possible, John, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that have kind of gone into that. And one being the youth worker role identity as being very critical for a youth worker in general doing good work.
I'm happy to talk to you offline. I think some, though not all, of those issues that you raise are addressed in the various modules.
And I was just, I guess, wondering too, do you have capacity to do a training for managers in particular, so that is also being spoken about, because it was about organizational culture and power hierarchies and making sure there's no disconnection?
Yeah. Well, I think if a manager were to go through the modules, they would get the same messages that we would give if we were to talk directly to managers, but be happy to consider something like that.
Yeah.
Awesome. We should move on because there are other people with questions.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks. Casey, please go ahead.
It's Karen, I think.
Is Casey finished? Karen?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you for your presentation, John. Really liked it. And I just wondered whether it's a similar question to Casey's, actually. I just wondered, given that some organisations are and have to be fairly risk averse, whether or not, in terms of the development of the community of practice, there's a way of keeping, and this might actually also have been Drew's question in a way, how is it that the practitioners can manage the impact of taking good risks on them professionally, especially if they don't have supportive management?
Well, I don't think you can if you don't have supportive management. I think that's the point that it. I mean, well, I think you have to set the boundaries much closer if you don't have supportive management. It's still possible to, like in a residential care setting where you're uncomfortable with management, it's not quite bad enough for you to leave, but you don't like the way that you're being managed. It's still possible within the ordinary day-to-day management and support of young people to take more risks, but you obviously wouldn't feel prepared to take a more substantial risk if you didn't know you had managers who were supportive of you.
Yeah, and I think
It's
that's
only through reflection that you can, I know, I hear the request, and the logic behind youth workers need to draw clear boundaries. I'm not sure that's possible. I think if you're drawing clear boundaries, they're going to be too narrow. If you want a boundary that's going to fully protect you, you won't be able to do your work. So how to expand that boundary is really what requires reflective practice.
yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think that the the greatest progress in doing therapeutic work is when you are able to take some of those creative risks. And I think there are a lot of people who just aren't able to do those things because it's too restrictive where they're working.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, that's a comment more than a question.
That's good. Thank you.
Kelly? You're on mute, Kelly. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, here we go. Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, John. That was a fantastic presentation. A few comments that I had to make was that there's two youth workers here. We work for Kogel together. We run the Kogel Youth Action, and we work 18 hours a week. So we have drop-in 2 afternoons a week, and we can have up to 30 youth. So I love what you're saying, and it's really great for foundation of the way that we enter into the workspace. However, I mean, talking about boundaries, we also have to acknowledge that there are certain restrictions on what we can do. We're in a regional town, and we just don't have any local services to refer to, and difficulty getting into Lismore. So I'm just talking on behalf of the regional services, and it sort of goes back into you that you are providing the information for us to do our jobs better and for us to have less requirement to refer to services that are not going to pick them up because they're already overrun. But at the same time, being responsible within ourselves. I've got the best management, I've got to say. I love my job. I love the management. But yeah, within the 18 hours a week, we have to do everything.
I think it's a really important point, Kelly, and there are always going to be restrictions. Like, I hope I haven't given the impression that, if you're managing properly and being managed properly, you can do everything and everything is going to turn out okay. You do have to be mindful of what systemic boundaries there are, what your own level of skill and training and support is, and you have to operate within those boundaries. But too often, I think the boundaries are drafted in a different way by KPIs and risk aversion and those kinds of things.
Yep, point taken.
If I can add to that, Kelly, is that it's partly paramount for youth work and community development to work hand in hand. And one of those things that the youth work and social services exist because there's been a breakdown in the community. So in situations like yourself, and I have worked in some of those situations, I've tried to actually put some of my time into actually bringing other members of the community on board to do exactly that. Just being there to listening to young people as they do to their own children, but to the neighbors' children and to the neighbors' children. So it's sort of, we got to start encouraging that. Otherwise, there will be never enough of us funded to do the work that the community needs to do. Alex, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I guess I've recently been reading about the Queensland's child death review report, where they've some of the reports I've read have been saying that it's seen the system kind of providing more transactional roles, and showing a system that doesn't really, has forgotten to care, and it's resulting in a lot of young people, especially in resi care, not having their needs met for especially connection and love. I guess my question when you were talking about how paramount connection is providing those avenues of like connection and love in a system where, as youth workers and social workers, we're kind of trained not to, and also providing those kind of needs while not exposing young people to potentially people trying to take advantage of them.
Yeah. That's a really important issue, managing that boundary in that direction, which is kind of the opposite from the one that we've been talking about, when it's too much, when is a relationship too much? I think that's something that if that becomes troubling, if negotiating that judgment, I mean, well, there's two levels. There's the individual level. Do I need some help here? Do I need, I'm not doing anything wrong, but do I need some help to decide what's okay and what's not okay, and what's going too far and what's not looking after myself? So that's the individual stuff that might be dealt with quite simply in a conversation with a colleague, or it might require something more formal. But then there's a systemic issue about what's acceptable in this environment and what's not, and not allowed to touch anybody, or when those kinds of things are in place in residential units, it really does make things very difficult. If you are constrained by some non-negotiable that potentially compromises relationship with kids, the only thing I can think of is to be playful with it, to make fun of it in some way, to mock it, adhere to it, but I don't know, off the top of my head, this is a time when I would have liked to have put my hand on your shoulder, but big boss says I'm not allowed to do that, or something like that. Because directly challenging it might be too dangerous for somebody in a relatively low-paid, low-power position. We've got to acknowledge those power relationships, and YANQ would love to abolish them, but they're going to be there for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Yeah, tricky question. I guess it's always continuing on, but thanks for your response anyway. Appreciate it.
And Alex, you've been involved in our community of practice. This is one of the things that we ongoingly talk about and discuss. But it is, my view is that the only thing that separates us as youth workers from other people working with young people is that very thing, to actually being there, sitting and building a relationship. And that relationship needs to be actually long-term, so that young people, we go through the process of earning the trust, not developing it, earning the trust, so that they actually come and speak to us and we do something. Otherwise, we're no different to being a guidance officer, I don't know, anything else. And potentially in the future being replaced by something like a Coke machine, which would be just like a referral system where Social Security gives you a ticket and you go as a young person, and here's a referral to housing, education, everything, which is unfortunately a lot of the times not taken by that sort of just referring on. And I think the report you mentioned about the child death review highlighted some of that some of these young people just get referred from one service to another. Nobody actually sits and bothers to develop a relationship with them to actually see what's going on. It's become so shallow.
Yeah, which is why organisations like YANQ are so important. And those of you in Queensland need to be active in supporting YANQ being refunded in some way. And those of you who are grateful to YANQ for putting together today's seminar and the learning modules might see fit to make some kind of donation to YANQ to try and keep it going until somebody funds it properly.
I'd like to make a comment too, if I could, just about the relationships that we build with young people. And you've said it again, there. They've got to be long-term relationships, and I know that is really hard in youth services that are early intervention services, I might only have a small window to work with young people. But the reality is, you need to have that long-term relationship. I've got young people now I worked with 20 years ago who track me down on Facebook, and now I've actually see where their life is at. And I can tell you from a youth work perspective where we rarely see we've had an impact. When young people hunt you down to let you know how they're going, you've had an impact. And it's all about those relationships. And I will stay involved in the sector, but probably no more face-to-face. But yeah, I've got young people, half a dozen who are friending me now that I'm not working. I said, yes, I'll accept your friend request now. I've worked with them some of them for the last 8 years, known them as young 11, 12-year-olds. Now they're young adults. Relationship people, that's what it is. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Not seeing anyone, anything. There was some comment in the comment box about people being interested in reward punishment behavior management, that concept. So it might be some future session that we could potentially explore that in more detail.
Cool.
Yeah. Corey, you got your hands up. Please go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I was just going to bring up what you just said, the rewards versus punishment. So I work in a residential care facility, and it's what we do every day, behaviour modification. So I just wanted you to give a bit more context to what you meant by that, John.
Well, I guess the gist of it is that inside us, we're all responding to internal rewards and punishments that we want to do things that minimize pain and maximize pleasure or comfort or safety. And if we put somebody onto a behavior management program, we're going into competition with their internal reward and punishment system. And all we can really do is make them try harder. And a lot of the kids I see are already exhausted by trying to make things better for themselves. So what we risk doing when we introduce a reward and punishment program is just reinforcing the kids' sense of failure. So sometimes they succeed because sometimes they break a sort of, a bad habit. But I just don't think it's the right way to think about young people's behaviour. I think we're pretty much out of time, but I'm very happy to talk with CEMH or others about a seminar about that stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, John.
It's a big area to explore, so hopefully, yes, we can organize a session on that. Any other final comments, questions before we wrap it up? No. Well, before closing, I just want to first and foremost thank John so much for everything that you've done. John has been a long-term supporter of the youth sector and has dedicated so much of his time and energy. And this project has been amazing. You will all see the resources that they've developed. I've just gone through them and they're just absolutely fantastic. I think you will find them very useful. Thank you so much, John, for giving us your time today as well. Also, thank Anthony Smith and Melissa Raven, colleagues of John, who have written the book, the Language Matters, and for also making it available to us at cost price, so we can distribute to you guys in the youth sector. Really appreciate that, Anthony and Melissa. Thanks to Rachel Donovan, some of you would remember her, who was at the moment in Nepal. She wasn't able to join us, but she basically headed our work around administering the surveys last year and conducting the interviews and the reference group. The Gaming Community Benefit Fund for actually funding this project. We couldn't have gone ahead without it. The Department of Child Safety who for the past few years have supported YANQ's community of practice. Unfortunately, this year they have said they're not going to continue that, so we have to basically do that on volunteer basis from here on. Thanks to all of you who completed the surveys, participated in the interviews and focus groups, and also some of you on the reference group. And last but not least, all of you who participated today. It's been great having you on board. So after this meeting this afternoon, I will send you all a link to the training packages on Adelaide University. And you will be able to enroll and access them straight away. And I will also, we'll organize in the next few days to also post you out the copy of the book that we've mentioned. For the Queensland youth sector, our next community of practice is going to be held on 1st of April. And hopefully by then you'll have the chance to explore some of the resources, read the book, and at the April session, we will have the opportunity to raise any questions, ask any questions, talk about any future resources we need. And John is going to join us for that session as well on 1st of April. I'll send out a flyer about that. And if you're based in other states, perhaps you can contact your state peak body in your state and see if they are able to negotiate with John's team in Adelaide Uni for hosting similar sessions. As I mentioned earlier, YANQ is running without any operational funding. So as John kindly said, if you find these resources helpful and if you share YANQ's vision about creating a more caring society for young people to flourish in, please consider making a donation to us. We don't have any funding whatsoever, and we run basically on volunteer basis, but these things take a lot of resources, as you would know, to actually do. There's a donation button on the front page of YANQ's website. YANQ is just, you can, it's searching YANQ, you'll get that page. Email us any feedback about the session you have about today's session as well. We're always keen to hear and try to improve what we're doing. And thank you all. And if there's nothing else, I will close the meeting and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Siavash, sorry, I just had one quick question around the training module. Is there any deadline to it, or will it be lifelong access?
No, it's ongoing. It's open. You do it in your own time.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's okay.
And thank you, John, as well.
Thank you all.